Susan Whittaker was not born with much, but she never complained. She was the kind of woman who knew how to stretch a single bag of rice into 4 different meals. The kind who could sew up a torn jacket in 20 minutes flat, patching the holes so neatly no one would ever know it had been broken. She worked hard, not out of pride, but out of necessity. Because for most of her adult life, she only had one goal: to give her son, Daniel, a life better than hers. It wasn't just about providing food and shelter, it was about dignity. About making sure he never had to feel the small, shameful things she had grown used to, like counting coins at the checkout line, or pretending not to see the eviction notice taped to the door. Daniel had been her world from the moment he was born. She raised him alone. Daniel's father had vanished before he was even old enough to remember his name. Susan never spoke poorly of the man, though she would have had plenty of reason to. Instead, she told Daniel that his father had been young and scared, that he had missed out, that Thish and Daniel were strong enough to build a life on their own. And they did. Their apartment was small, just 2 rooms and one of those kitchens that barely had enough counter space to chop an onion. But it was filled with laughter. Susan sang while folding laundry. Daniel, bright and clever, used to build cities out of cereal boxes and toilet paper rolls. He never complained, never whined about not having the newest toys or the coolest clothes. He used to look at her like she was magic. Back then, Susan had believed love was enough. 2. She worked 2 jobs for most of Daniel's childhood weekdays at the local library and weekends cleaning houses. When Daniel was 10, she took a night shift at the hospital cafeteria just to afford his first proper computer. He cried when he saw it. "Is it really for me?" Susan smiled. "All yours." She lived for those moments. The look of awe on his face, the way he hugged her so tight she thought her ribs would crack. He promised her he'd be someone one day, that he'd buy her a house with a porch and a garden, that she'd never have to work again. At night, when her hands ached and her feet throbbed, Susan would lie awake thinking about that future. Her son, successful. Her back, finally rested. A garden full of flowers, just like the ones she used to draw in the margins of her notebooks as a girl. She never once imagined that same boy would one day look at her and wince. 2. Things started to shift when Daniel turned 15. It wasn't sudden, more like a slow, creeping change that Susan couldn't quite name at first. He still hugged her, but less often. Still said, "I love you," but mostly when prompted. He started hanging around the wealthier kids at school, the ones who lived in houses with more bathrooms than people, whose parents drove SUVs and vacationed in Aruba. Daniel had always been ambitious, and Susan encouraged that. But sometimes, she'd catch a strange look on his face when his friends dropped him off outside their worn apartment building, a flicker of something. Not quite shame. Not yet, but close. He stopped inviting people over. Stopped asking her to come to parent nights. He said it was because she worked late, and she did, but she still offered to switch shifts, to call in favors. "It's fine, Mom," he'd say, eyes on his phone. "I got it." Susan told herself it was normal. Teenagers grew distant. They needed space, independence. She didn't want to be one of those smothering mothers, the kind who held too tight and watched their children twist in resentment. But deep down, a small, quiet fear began to take root. What if, when he finally had the life she never could, he wouldn't want to bring her with him? 2. Daniel went to college on a partial scholarship and 1,000 silent sacrifices. Susan sold her old car to cover what the grant didn't. She took on extra shifts, started freelancing as a typist at night. She sent him care packages with homemade cookies and thrifted sweaters. She never visited the campus. Daniel said it was better that way, that he was too busy anyway. She didn't question it. At least, not out loud. Instead, she bought a little notebook from the dollar store and filled it with every expense she covered. Not because she wanted him to repay her, no. Never that, but because she wanted to remember. Wanted proof that, even if no one else saw it, she had done everything she could. It wasn't until graduation that the first real break came. She had taken the weekend off, booked a bus ticket, ironed her best blouse. She was ready, nervous, excited, proud beyond words. She had even practiced what she would say when she met his friends. But the day before the ceremony, Daniel called. "Mom," he said, voice tight. "I think maybe you shouldn't come." Susan thought she hadn't heard correctly. "What do you mean?" It's going to be crowded. And look, there's not enough tickets for everyone. Rachel's parents are flying in. It's kind of a big deal. I don't want it to be complicated." That word, complicated. It clung to her like smoke. "I understand," she said, somehow keeping her voice level. "I'll watch the live stream." She sat alone that weekend, made herself a cup of tea, watched her son cross the stage through a tiny window on her cracked laptop screen. She clapped anyway. But something inside her folded in half. 2A. Daniel didn't come home after graduation. He moved in with Rachel, a girl from a wealthy family who had once, in high school, called Susan quaint at a PTA meeting. Rachel, with her designer clothes and perfect hair, and mother who once asked Susan if she was the nanny. Still, Susan smiled when Daniel called, asked about his job, his apartment, his health. She sent him soup when he was sick, cards on his birthday, a new watch when he got his promotion. He didn't visit, not once in 2 years. Then one day, he called out of the blue. "Hey," he said, trying to sound casual. "So, Rachel and I are getting married." Susan blinked back tears. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." "Yeah," he said. Then, after a pause, "It's going to be kind of fancy. Her family's paying for most of it. Just wanted to give you a heads up." Susan's hands tightened on the phone. "Of course, I wouldn't expect otherwise." Daniel laughed awkwardly. "I just don't want anyone to, you know, feel out of place." He didn't say it, but she heard it anyway. "You're the one who doesn't belong." 2. And yet, she still showed up. She bought a new dress, had her hair done at the cheap salon down the street, wore the pearl earrings her own mother had given her. She smiled through the ceremony, clapped with the crowd, told everyone how proud she was. Until the reception. Until she walked past a group of Rachel's cousins whispering by the bar. "That's his mom? I thought she was the maid." They laughed. Susan stopped, turned, tried to speak. But Daniel was there first, and he didn't correct them. He just laughed, too. Awkward, forced, but real. And in that moment, something inside Susan, something soft and tender and full of years of sacrifice broke. She didn't stay for cake. Didn't say goodbye. She walked out, heels clicking against marble, her eyes fixed forward. And for the first time in 30 years, she let herself be angry. Susan didn't go home that night. Not right away. Instead, she walked for miles, past glittering hotel windows, down rows of parked cars dressed in wedding ribbons and leftover champagne laughter. Her shoes blistered her feet, and she welcomed the pain. It was something real, something earned. Unlike the applause her son had received for a life she had built, only to be hidden away from it. By the time she reached her apartment, the makeup had smudged, and her dress hung limp with humidity. But she didn't cry. Not that night. She stood in front of the mirror, looked at her reflection lines carved deep by sacrifice, by sleepless nights, by hard-earned survival, and asked the question she had never dared before. Why wasn't I enough? Not rich enough. Not refined enough. Not presentable enough to be the mother of a man who had climbed so high he forgot the rungs beneath his feet. 2A. The next morning, she boxed up everything that reminded her of Daniel. The baby pictures, the crayon Mother's Day cards, the college acceptance letter she had framed, back when pride still outweighed bitterness. She didn't throw them away, she wasn't cruel, but she packed them into a storage unit she rented in cash and locked the door. She told herself it was for her own good. That clinging to memories of a boy who no longer existed wouldn't make the shame sting any less. Then she did something she hadn't done in over 20 years. She thought about herself. 2. Susan was 58. She worked part-time as a clerk at the same library where she had once shelved books to keep the lights on. The pay hadn't improved, but at least she liked the quiet. the smell of old paper, the silence no one dared to disturb. But now, every time she sat behind the counter, stamping return slips, she could feel her son's voice echoing in her head. It's going to be kind of fancy. I don't want anyone to feel out of place. She had felt out of place all her life. In restaurants where she mispronounced the wine. In department stores where the clerks followed her too closely. At her son's wedding, where even the air felt too expensive for her lungs. So she decided to change that. Not for Daniel. Not to earn back a place in a life she had built. But for herself. 2A. She took a loan. A small one. Enough to enroll in a course at the community college downtown business administration for seniors. Most of her classmates were retirees trying to start Etsy stores or finally get the degree they'd sacrificed for their kids. Susan told them she was there for personal growth, but secretly, she had a plan. She wanted to start a service for women like her mothers, caretakers, silent givers who had spent decades putting everyone else first. A consulting business. Resume building. Financial literacy. Even something as small as helping a woman set up her own bank account after a divorce. She called it Second Bloom. The name made her smile. She hadn't bloomed in a long time. 2. Word spread fast. Turns out, a lot of women had been called too embarrassing in one way or another. Too loud, too quiet, too emotional, too independent, too unfitting. They came to Susan's tiny rented office behind the hardware store and found a woman who understood them without needing to ask. By year's end, Second Bloom had partnered with 2 local nonprofits. Susan was invited to speak at a city event on women's empowerment. Her picture was featured in the local news miling, no makeup, holding a certificate in one hand and a woman's hand in the other. She didn't think of Daniel once that night, but he saw the article. 2. Mom? His voice was hesitant, like a boy who just realized the door he'd slammed was locked from the other side. Susan paused. It had been nearly 10 months since the wedding. 10 months without a single call, card, or text. 10 months of silence that felt strangely peaceful. I saw the paper, Daniel said. That's really something. Thank you, she said, not cold, but not warm either. I didn't know you were doing all that. You never told me. Susan smiled, even though he couldn't see it. I figured you had enough on your plate. He hesitated. Rachel and we've been going through stuff. It's been a rough year. She waited. He added, I wanted to say sorry for how the wedding went down. I shouldn't have let them talk like that. I should have. Should have what? She asked gently. Stopped them? Introduced me properly? Stood next to me instead of stepping away? Daniel was quiet. I was embarrassed, he finally said. Not of you, of the difference between you and everything else around me. Susan took a breath, not in pain, but in clarity. That difference is the only reason you were in that room, Daniel. 2. They talked for another 10 minutesimal things, half apologies, scattered updates. He asked to meet for coffee. Susan agreed, but with a strange calm in her chest. The kind of calm that comes when you finally realize you don't need permission to take up space. They met on a Tuesday. He hugged her. She let him. He brought flowers. She thanked him. But when he asked if he could stop by her office, she smiled and said, Maybe next time. I have a client meeting. The look on his face? Like he had walked into a house he used to own, only to realize the locks had been changed. Daniel stood outside his apartment building, the one with glass railings and concierge service, staring at the key fob in his hand like it was mocking him. It didn't beep, didn't light up, just sat there, useless. He tried it again, and again. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside, the concierge said from behind the desk. It wasn't the usual guy, this one was new, younger, and didn't know Daniel personally. I live here, Daniel insisted, voice tight. Not anymore, the man said. You were removed from the lease. The building manager said to direct you to legal if you have questions. Daniel laughed too loud, too bitter. He looked up at the skyline, a blur of lights and wealth and cold steel. Then back at the doors that used to open for him like magic. Now they didn't even recognize him. 2. It had started unraveling weeks earlier, but he hadn't noticed. Or maybe he refused to. Rachel had become distant. Less laughter, more sighs, more dinners out with friends, more vague answers. And when she did speak, there was an undercurrent of disappointment in her voices if she had found the thread she pulled him into her world with had frayed, and now she couldn't remember why she chose him at all. It all came to a head at a gala for a startup she invested in. Daniel had shown up late. He hadn't worn the cufflinks she gave him. And when the conversation turned toward family, and someone joked, "Daniel, tell us again about your mom. Wasn't she a librarian or something?" He smiled politely and changed the subject. But Rachel didn't smile. Not anymore. 2. The next day, she asked him directly, "Do you feel ashamed of your mother?" He blinked, caught off guard. "What? No. I mean, come on. We just come from different worlds, that's all." Rachel's face didn't change. "You told me she raised you alone. Took double shifts. Cleaned other people's houses just to keep food on the table." "She did. And I love her for it. But you don't invite her. You don't talk about her. She wasn't even at Thanksgiving." Daniel was quiet. Rachel stood up, arms folded. "You're so obsessed with fitting into this world you forgot where you came from." That was the last real conversation they had. 3 days later, he came home to find the locks changed. 2. He sat on a park bench, bags at his feet, suit wrinkled and phone battery at 4%. He could have called friends, but none of them were really his. They were Rachel's network, her world. Without her, he was background noise. So he did what came naturally. He called his mother. It rang. And rang. No answer. 2. The voicemail clicked on, her voice warm but distant. "Hi, this is Susan. I'm not available right now, probably working with a client or out walking. Leave a message and I'll get back to you if I can." He stared at the phone for a long time. Then he called again. No answer. Again. No answer. He sent a text. "Mom, I need you. Can we talk?" Nothing. 2. Susan was busy. She wasn't ignoring him to punish him, not intentionally. That morning, she had taken the train to another city to speak at a community event for women re-entering the workforce. She had printed brochures, practiced her speech, and brought snacks for everyone. She stood at the podium, looked out over the sea of tired but hopeful faces, and smiled. 10 minutes into her talk, her phone buzzed. She silenced it. She wasn't thinking about Daniel. She was thinking about the woman in the front row, clutching a notebook like it was a lifeline. She was thinking about the girl who asked, "How do you start over when everyone thinks you're nothing?" She was thinking about herself. Finally, 2A. Daniel ended up at a cheap motel, paid in cash, ate from vending machines, woke up every hour to stare at the ceiling. He wanted to hate Rachel, but he didn't. He understood. She hadn't fallen in love with him. She had fallen in love with the version of him that hid Susan, and now that version had collapsed. 2. 3 days later, Susan returned the call. She met him at a quiet diner on the edge of town. Not one of those hipster places with overpriced lattes, just a place with cracked vinyl booths and bad coffee. Daniel looked older. Not tired, just faded. Like someone had drained the color from him. She sat down. No hug, just a nod. "I messed everything up," he said. Susan stirred her coffee. "I know. I thought if I just kept climbing, I could lift us both. I could make you proud." She looked at him. "You were always enough, but then you made me feel like I wasn't." His shoulders sank. "I didn't mean to." "I know," she said. "But you did." 2. He cried. Right there. In public. Didn't care who saw. "I don't know where to go." Susan sipped her coffee. "You always have a place, but you're not a boy anymore. I won't rescue you like before. If you want a fresh start, you'll build it, like I did." He nodded, slowly. "Can I stay with you, just for a bit?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, You can visit, but you won't move back in. That door closed. 2. He stayed in a shelter for a few nights. Found a job stocking shelves at a hardware store. Quiet work. Honest work. He started saving. He'd stop by Susan's office sometimes. Help with errands. Bring her tea. They didn't talk about the past much. But once, as they locked up for the night, he said, "You were never too embarrassing. I was just too small to see your worth." Susan didn't reply. She just handed him the keys and said, "Be careful, it's dark out." The air smelled like rain that evening. Daniel had just stepped off the city bus, a reusable canvas bag slung over his shoulder, filled with groceries and a plastic container of homemade soup Susan had given him the day before. His shift at the hardware store had been long. Not difficult, just repetitive restocking drywall screws, explaining drill bits to customers who rarely looked him in the eye. But it paid enough for now. It was quiet, honest, and that, for once, felt like enough. He walked the rest of the way to the temporary room he rented above a closed-down travel agency. It smelled faintly of mildew. The wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the shower ran rust-brown for the first minute each time. But it had a lock. It had peace. It had silence. 2. In that silence, Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He remembered. He remembered being 7, watching his mom fall asleep at the kitchen table over a pile of bills. He remembered how she'd still get up at 5 to walk him to school, pack his lunch with sticky notes that said, "You're my favorite reason to smile." He remembered the time he scraped his knee on the playground, and while other kids had to wait for the nurse, she showed up 15 minutes later with Band-Aids, cookies, and that unshakable look in her eyes like nothing in the world mattered more. He remembered the warmth of her hugs, the way her voice cracked when she said, "I'm proud of you." He also remembered the first time he saw Rachel. She was sunlight bottled in a woman. Sharp, ambitious, beautiful. She wore her confidence like armor, and her wealth like perfume, always present, always noticed. He remembered how fast he shrank himself to fit her world, and how, in doing so, he'd erased his mother. 2. Back in Susan's apartment, life was slower now. She woke up before sunrise and made tea instead of coffee. She'd started growing herbs on her windowsill and took walks without her phone. She taught small workshops in the community center on budgeting, on resumes, on how to hold your head up high even if your shoes were secondhand. She didn't talk about Daniel much. People asked. Of course they did. Isn't that the boy who made the news? I saw your story on a blog. Was that your son? He's lucky to have a mom like you. Susan would smile, politely, quietly, and then redirect the conversation. Because she wasn't bitter. She was just done performing pain for others. 2. One Tuesday afternoon, Susan got a letter. Not an email, not a text, a real letter. The handwriting was messy, unsure. Inside were 3 items. 1. A photo of a garden Daniel had helped restore behind the shelter. 2. A short note. We planted lavender. You used to love lavender. 3. A folded flyer from the shelter's annual fundraiser, with a small line handwritten at the bottom. Would love if you came. No pressure. Just, would love it. She stared at the flyer for a long time. Then she folded it again, placed it on the kitchen counter, and went back to kneading dough. 2. She didn't show up. At least not that night. Daniel sat at a folding table with the other volunteers, nervously glancing at the door every 5 minutes. He wore his only blazer, too tight at the shoulders, borrowed from a coworker. He spoke about the restoration work, how it helped him find a rhythm again. He smiled when people clapped. He didn't cry. Not then. But when he got home and saw the missed call on his phone, and the voicemail that simply said, "Lavender's hard to grow in full sun. Tell them to water it at dusk." He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for months. 2. Their healing wasn't cinematic. No dramatic reunions, no public apologies. It was smaller than that. He started showing up at Susan's every Sunday. Sometimes he brought pastries. Sometimes just silence. They didn't rehash the past. They built something new in its place. One day, as they walked down the street, a woman approached Susan, eyes wide. "You're the mom from the internet, right? The one whose son?" Susan held up a hand, smiled gently. "No, I'm the woman who finally learned she didn't have to beg to be respected." The woman blinked, nodded, moved on. Daniel heard every word. He didn't say anything, but that night, he wrote something down in a notebook. A single sentence. "She didn't need forgiveness, I needed to earn it." 2 months passed. Daniel got promoted to assistant manager. He started taking night classes, something in nonprofit management. Said he wanted to help people like himself, like his mom. Rachel never contacted him. He didn't expect her to. She'd likely moved on another man, another penthouse, another carefully curated dinner party where no one mentioned where they came from. He didn't resent her. He pitied her, because for all her wealth and pride, she never knew what it felt like to sit at a scratched-up kitchen table across from a woman who had nothing but still gave you everything. 2 One spring morning, Susan invited Daniel to her apartment. She had baked too much. Banana bread. 2 loaves. It was an excuse. He came in, took off his shoes, sat quietly. There was a gift box on the table. She pushed it toward him. "Open it." Inside was the old watch, the one he pawned years ago, the one he thought she'd never see again. "How?" "I bought it back," she said, "the same day you handed it over." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you didn't ask, and because I didn't want to hold it over you. But I kept it, because it was the last piece of you I had that didn't hurt." Daniel swallowed hard. He reached for the watch, then stopped. "Keep it," he said. "You earned it." Susan looked at him, something soft in her eyes. "No," she said. "Now it belongs to both of us." 2 Later that evening, he walked home with a small smile. The watch ticked on his wrist. Time wasn't just moving forward anymore. It was healing.